Previously, in actual history. Why do historians often consider American chattel slavery one of the most heinous legacies of human trafficking on the planet? Do we really have to go through this again? Yeah, all right. But what did African slavery look like then? Okay, well, let's start here. See, in the very diverse continent of Africa, you had nations, what some call tribes or tribal nations, like the Akan people, the Mandingo people, Songhai people, the Mamprusi people, the Edo people. And many times those nations would rise to become kingdoms and empires, like the Ashanti kingdom of the Akan, or the Mali empire of the Mandingo, or the Songhai empire of the Songhai, Mossi kingdoms of the Mamprusi warriors, or the Benin empire of the Edo people, in which other once rivaling nations had to wield to their control by paying taxes or in service in what was called slavery or prisoners of war from the internation or intertribal conflict, but ultimately they were treated far more like European serfs. In other words, like most of the population of Europe. For example, in the Ashanti Kingdom of West Africa, one observer noted that a slave might marry, own property, himself own a slave, swear an oath, be a competent witness, and ultimately become heir to their quote-unquote master. An Ashanti slave, 9 times out of 10, possibly became an adopted member of the family, and in time, his descendants so merged and intermarried with the supposed owners, kinsmen, that only a few would ever remember their origin. One former human trafficker turned anti-slavery activist from Europe, John Newton, wrote about the people of what is now Sierra Leone. Their state of slavery is much milder than in our colonies. They have no call for that excessive, unintermitted labor which exhausts our slaves, and no man is permitted to draw blood from even a slave. So, here are the major differences. Number 1, slavery in Africa was not heritable, meaning your children were born free. Number 2, it was not lifelong. Number 3, it wasn't generationally, psychologically crippling. Number 4, it didn't destroy family ties without any hope of a future. Number 5, as historian Howard Zinn puts it, African slavery lacked 2 elements that made American slavery the most cruel form of slavery in history. A, the frenzy for limitless profit that comes from capitalistic agriculture, aka big business. And B, the reduction of the hostage into less than human status by the use of racial hatred, with that relentless clarity based on color, where white was master and black was slave. So when Europeans came down to some of these kingdoms and purchased some of their slaves, one could bet that African kingdoms had no idea how vastly different their definitions of slave would be. In fact, Europeans went to great lengths to influence African traders and leaders to traffic their war captives to them in exchange for their goods. They would go so far as forming military alliances with African kingdoms to instigate fighting so as to increase the number of captives, and even shifted the location of disembarking points for their trade ships to follow African military conflicts along the West and Central African coast. As a result of their infiltration and instigation of intertribal West African conflicts, this ultimately rendered many kingdoms weaker and desperate to give them whom they asked. But nevertheless, those African traders and rulers who participated in the slave trade were by no means heroes. Goree Island was a place in Ghana where many Africans were traded and sold into slavery to European colonizers, often by desperate and greed-induced West African merchants. This is the door of no return, one of the many ports where African people who were kidnapped from their homes became traded for material goods. They were captured in the interior, frequently by West African traders, sold on the coast, then shoved into pens with Africans of other tribes, often speaking other languages. The marches to the coast, sometimes for 1,000 miles, with people shackled around their neck under whip and gun, were death marches, in which 2 of every 5 West Africans died before even reaching the coast. On the coast, they were kept in cages until they were picked and sold. One, John Barbeau, at the end of the 17th century, described these cages on the Gold Coast. As the slaves came down to Fida from the inland country, they are put into a booth, or prison, near the beach, and when the Europeans are to receive them, they are brought out onto a large plain, where the ship's surgeons examine every part of every one of them to the smallest member, men and women being stark naked. Such as are allowed good and sound are set on one side, marked on the breast with a red-hot iron, imprinting the mark of the French, English, or Dutch companies. The branded slaves after this are returned to their former booths, where they await shipment, sometimes 10 to 15 days. Then they were packed aboard the slave ships, in spaces not much bigger than coffins, chained together in the dark, wet slime of the ship's bottom, choking in the stench of their own excrement. Documents of the time describe the conditions. The height, sometimes between decks, was only 18 inches, so that the unfortunate human beings could not turn around, or even on their sides. The elevation being less than the breadth of their shoulders, and here they are, usually chained to the decks by the neck and legs. In such a place, the sense of misery and suffocation is so great that they're driven to frenzy. Many often jumped overboard to drown rather than continue their suffering. To one observer, a slave deck was so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. Under these conditions, perhaps 1 of every 3 Africans transported overseas died, but the huge profits, often double the investment on one trip, made it worthwhile for the slave trader. And so, West Africans were continually packed into the holds like fish. So yeah, I said what I said. Sadism. By 1800, 10 to 15 million West Africans had been trafficked to the Americas, representing perhaps 1/3 of those originally seized on the coast. It is roughly estimated that Africa lost 50 million human beings to death and slavery in those centuries we call the beginnings of modern Western civilization, at the hands of traffickers in Western Europe and America, the countries deemed the most advanced in the world. In Benin, a professor of history there, Olabi Babalola Joseph Yai, says this is still a country divided between the families of those enslaved and the slave traders. In villages where people were abducted for the slave trade, where thousands of people were seized and sold in the 18th and 19th centuries, families still ask reflexively when they hear a knock on the door whether the visitor is a human being or a slave raider. Our anger at the families who sold our ancestors will never go away until the end of the world. Well, that was dark. Don't mean melanin. Let's not get it twisted. The traders and the royalty who approved this were dead wrong. Like, dead wrong. Because as desperate as they may have become by European infiltration, they still allowed the ransacking of people from their homes and families to complete and utter strangers. There's no romanticizing that. Hence the Killmonger Wakanda beef that we all felt. This is Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori, a West African prince who was kidnapped and sold into slavery on a Mississippi plantation. After somehow making it through the shackled journey across the Atlantic, he begged the trafficker about to purchase him to understand the terrible mistake that he wasn't supposed to be enslaved.
My pop said Wakanda was the most beautiful thing you ever seen. He promised he was gonna show it to me one day. You believe that?
Maybe we can still heal you.
Why? So you could just lock me up? Nah. Just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ships. Because they knew death was better than bondage.